please feel free to jump into chat and tell us where you're zooming into us from. We're happy to have you here. Oh, I have to tell my panelists that I've stacked the room. I see a couple of colleagues of mine who are already here. You all got to promise not to cheer too loud, but thank you for coming. If you're just joining us, feel free to jump into chat. Let us know where you're coming in from. We'll wait just one more minute and then we're going to get started. This is fun. I have 3 different clocks in my house, but by my clock, it is now 9 o'clock. It's time to get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our session. My name is Chris Cartwright, and I'm the moderator of this session for the Kozai group. Today, we're going to talk about inclusion and how you can teach or train for inclusion. It's work that the Kozai group feels deeply about, and we're thrilled to do this. I'm particularly pleased because we have 3 exemplars of people who have really dug deep into developing a practice around teaching and training for inclusion. We have a partner of mine in the Kozai group, Dr. Joanne Barnes, who's also on the faculty of Indiana Wesleyan. She works both with corporations as well as academic institutions and even a couple of nonprofits, and teaching and training for inclusion. Played a major role in developing the tool we're about to talk to you about. Dr. Janice Hall is a faculty member at the Pamplin College of Business at Virginia Tech. She too had made a big commitment to embed inclusion into an MBA program that she is in charge of, and she will be sharing her work. And finally, Dr. Reverend Brian Tillman, my good friend who prefers to be called Brian, from North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church, will be talking to us about how he has embedded inclusion into a program that he has developed for the practitioners within his conference at the church. I think you're going to be very pleased with this panel. And briefly as an overview, the Kozai group is an organization that develops instruments, psychometric assessment instruments that help people identify and develop key competencies. We've been doing this for many years and have developed some very fine tools for that work. About 5 or 6 years ago, we started talking amongst ourselves how we could contribute to the DEI field. What is it about what we do in individual competency development that support the greater need for better relations across diverse populations? And in that, we started looking at how individual development could play a role in this and what competencies could support that work. So we went about developing a new psychometric instrument called the Inclusion Competency Inventory. Did our work, found dimensions, tested them, developed a psychometric instrument, and feel good about that. We feel we have a fine tool to be offering the world. But that's the beginning of it. An instrument at its best is a heuristic, a gestalt, a way of looking, a model to look at the work and to help individuals better understand themselves and what they can do to do the work better. Today, we've assembled 3 experts who will show you how they have taken the construct of inclusion competency and built it into their work. Today's session, we're going to start with a very brief overview of what this work is, and then I have some guided discussions that the panelists are going to address about their practice with this work, followed by your Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen now. At any point in time, feel free to jump into chat and add questions if you'd like, and we'll address them as soon as we can. Okay. All right. So again, this is a guide to teaching and training for inclusion. And Brian, you wanted to do the first slide.
Sure. This is a diversity, equity, and inclusion slide that kind of gives you some brief definitions of those three terms, which are critically important for my work as Director of Inclusion and Advocacy for the North Georgia Conference. One of the things that I like to say to help people understand, particularly diversity and inclusion and their differences or nuance. And when I'm talking to my folks, I use this line that I've heard many times from folks who work in DEI, that diversity is about counting people and inclusion is about making people count. And so in my work, some of the things that we see that that I like to speak into is how we form groups, how we form leadership teams, how we identify resources and where we deploy those resources. And I work in the church context in the United Methodist Church. That's a high percentage of Caucasian Americans, but a significant number of people of color as well. And so when we form teams and groups, and we form the people that we know, the people that have clout, and then we look around the room and we notice that some folks are either completely absent in their representation, and we notice there's very few women, there's very few people of color. And then we make moves to go and bring those people in. That's diversity. Inclusion is on the front end, reaching out and connecting, building relationships, building those foundations so that you naturally pull on those folks automatically rather than adding them in later on. Diversity, equity, and inclusion makes organizations and systems better. They're more thorough, they're more nimble, they're more adaptable, and greater ideas, better ideas are created and sustained when we have diversity, equity, and inclusion inside of our organizations.
Thank you, Brian. I would be remiss if I didn't add here that we have some colleagues from Europe, and language is different around the world and how things are sequenced. And it's common in Europe for people to flip the order and call it EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion. But it's all within the same frame, and it's wonderful to have this work being done together by this fine team. Dr. Barnes, you developed this amazing model. Please describe it to the team.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cartwright, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this model that I've worked with the Kozai group because it allows us to look at inclusion competencies within the DEI space. And while our inclusion competencies comes in at an individual level of focus, we realize that there are external things and behavioral things that influence the way that we perceive inclusion and thus diversity, equity, and inclusion. From the outside, we look at cognition. These are the unconscious and conscious behaviors and attitudes that we have that influence the way that we understand other individuals. Our behaviors are based on our actions and our attitudes to those who may not be like us. And if we look at organizationals, we know that every organization that is focusing on DEI or EDI, they are working on developing tools to become more inclusive, looking at audits and benchmarking with other organizations, as well as creating policies and strategies to be a more inclusive organization. And then, of course, society calls us to action by looking at allies, understanding interculturalism, looking at critical theory, and examining Satagara, which was really developed from Gandhi in this world of trust and having total trust. So when we focus on the inclusion competencies, we look at knowing yourself, having a deep understanding of self-awareness, who we are, what are the actions that calls us to accept change and to be willing to change. In knowing others, we examine how do we read other individuals and how do we get to know other individuals at a deeper level, looking at connectivity. It's not just important to just know individuals, it's also important to connect with others and read others and not just saying, hey, how are you? But going deep into conversation to understand their worldviews and their perspectives. And bridging differences is one that I'm so passionate about, is because if we are going to be an inclusive organization, we need to value different perspectives. And the only way that we can do that is understand ourselves, understand others, and then listen intently. And that leads us to understanding power sensitivity within our organizations. Where is power housed? Who holds the power? When is power used incorrectly, where it creates a divide between us and them? So these are the three areas of the inclusion competency inventory, along with the subcomponents. Dr. Cartwright.
Mhm. So we're going to leverage the assessment. So when you give somebody an assessment, we're using a practice of what I call it the assessment to development practice that we are initiating our learners in. You offer them a view of themselves. I like to describe the giving of a psychometric assessment with all these different dimensions to like being a fine tailor and ushering your learner up on some steps and surrounding them with some mirrors and asking them to pivot and take a look at themselves in a new way and to reflect deeply on what they're seeing or not seeing. What are their strengths? What are their challenges? How they'll work with that. And then we start asking them how they're going to apply it in their context. What has meaning and value to them? What's most salient to them? And develop a personal development plan that will help them reach their goals in being more inclusive in their behaviors. Dr. Barnes?
Thank you, Dr. Cartwright. I think one of the things that really makes inclusion competencies come to light is that it's nothing that we just take an assessment and then we lay it to the side, is that we use personal development plans or PDPs in order to create a plan for us to enhance our positive behaviors and use those positive behaviors to better develop those that are not so positive or that are opportunities for improvement. So the first thing that we need to do is to create an action plan, to look at those competencies, to look at the sub-competencies, and then decide which one can I leverage in order to be better, to be stronger, to be more inclusive. And one of the ways that this helps is by getting an accountability partner. An accountability partner allows you to reflect, as Dr. Cartwright said, on what are the actions that you're going to take to become more inclusive. Do bi-weekly or weekly progress reports. Send the questions, the concerns to your accountability partner. Have meetings with those individuals to see where you're at. How are you developing? What are the roadblocks that you may be that may be occurring in this process of inclusion development? From that point, at the end, you really want to, I call it journaling, but you want to write this final report on what have you learned, not only about yourself, but those that are around you, those others that you have come to know more deeply, that you've been able to understand their worldview. How has that changed your behaviors towards individuals who may not look like you, who may not be like you, who have a different socioeconomic status than you? That final report, that journaling, which I say is continuous, it's not final. That's where the deep learning occurs. The personal development plan is not a one and done. It is a ongoing, beginning with 3 steps as you see on your screen, and then continuing to go back, examine those, and say, how can I continually improve to be more inclusive with all those I come in contact with? Dr. Cartwright.
Yeah. So what you want to do with any assessment that you work with is the idea of looking at the target areas of competency that you can leverage and develop. We all have strengths, and what we've learned in the field of competency development is that you can either go after something, say, I want that, I'm going to do the marathon and I'm going to do the training to do that. Or you can leverage a strength to shore up something. You can also compensate. You can say, I'm never going to get that, but there's other things around that I'm going to do to support it, and or frankly, rely on colleagues, your allies, to say, I don't see this. Do you see this? Give me some feedback. But those are the things you have to do, is really focus deeply on what you can do and develop and have focus on. Set goals. These are SMART goals. So really think about the how-tos. One of the things I'm constantly working on, I use these inventories in teaching global leadership and cultural competency at the university I adjunct in. It is the idea of focusing on micro practices. These are little things that you can do literally almost every day. So it becomes a practice. Where the joke amongst the colleagues who do this is, you're not going to become Gandhi on Tuesday. It's a step at a time, step at a time. You have to develop a practice, develop the muscle structure, and get used to doing it. And then reporting those results really helps. There's a whole cycle to this work. For those of you who teach reflective practice, this is a lot about in teaching and learning and in training, how you develop a reflective practice of who you are, what you're doing, who you're engaging, how is that going, and constantly refining it. We're never done. We're never done. My favorite final assignment is, what are you going to do for the 6 months when the class is over? There's always work to be done. We're never done. So again, this is the basic thing, is do an initial PDP, file your reports, and then make a final report and go deeper on that. And this is the practice that has developed as a result of learning to work with these assessments. This is the end of the PowerPoint part of the presentation. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing and talk to this amazing assembled panel. So panelists, we agreed on 4 questions. The first one is, why are you teaching or training for inclusion? What motivates you? Dr. Hall, we haven't had a chance to talk to you yet. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Again, I am Janice Hall. I serve as the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging for the Pamplin College of Business at Virginia Tech. And Pamplin is teaching, so let me just say that, our university and our college has gone through a lot of just changes and evolution as it relates to the issue of inclusion and DEIB. And our college has just recently, within the last 2 years, created an office for DEIB to help the college think about educational and pedagogical ways to incorporate inclusion into what we do. Pamplin is teaching for inclusion because, again, we have aspirations of being a world-class business school. And we know in order to be a world-class business school, we have to have the responsibility to prepare our students to really effectively navigate the diverse issues that they're going to encounter, particularly in business, but also in their daily interactions in the classroom, outside of the classroom, in society, and beyond. We also really want our students to walk away with the courage and the skills to lean into the societal realities that we all face, some good, some not so good, because we live in this such complex, pluralistic world where the dynamics of differences can either expand or stunt humanity's growth. Now, in Pamplin, we believe in people excellence, and that's what teaching for inclusion is really all about, equipping people, our people, with the critical skills to be excellent in whatever they do and whomever they interact with. Our college also works closely with corporate partners and industry experts who have advised us that the future workforce is going to need folks with the ability to engage cross-culturally and across different contexts to really catalyze positive change in their organizations and in society broadly. So beyond our partners, beyond it being the right thing to do, Our accreditation body, the AACSB, because we're in the business school, just added a new standard for all accredited business schools to focus on and really commit to positive societal impact. So holistically, we're teaching for inclusion because of the ethical and moral implications. So again, yes, the right thing to do, but also the proven outcomes that it offers to our people at the individual level, group dynamic, and organization broadly. Now, for our students, both undergraduate and graduate students, we've identified the theory of cultural humility as a critical framework for inspiring inclusive behaviors, and have really solidified our commitment to educating our stakeholders on these issues. So it's in our accreditation plan, it's in our strategic and implementation plans to ensure that we have the resources and support and infrastructure to do this effort and to educate our students well. And of course, it has become a core learning competency for our students.
Excellent, excellent. It's an inspiration. Congratulations to you and to your college for making this level of a commitment. Brian, we've known each other a while. You've done some fabulous work. Tell me why you decided to bring inclusion to your Methodist Church conference.
Yeah, so I'm in a religious context. In that context, I believe that the church should be open to all people, and that's open all the way through, from people sitting in our pews all the way up to the pulpit and church leadership. And that means people of different racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds as well. We are in an American context that's very polarized racially, and so we cannot assume that people come into our congregations fully able to be inclusive. And so therefore, we must train people in order to do that and to hold them accountable to those to that training. And so the ICI is one of the tools that helps us to help other people to strengthen their skills in inclusion. So we test folks who come through our academy. We have a Racial Justice and Healing Academy, and we test those folks. We give those folks the assessment, and to help them build PDPs to strengthen those areas where they feel they want to improve and grow, and then give them opportunities to practice them.
Excellent. Thank you much. Dr. Barnes, now you've been doing this both in the academic, the nonprofit, and the corporate side. So you've got a really broad range. So tell us why you're doing this work.
Thank you, Dr. Cartwright. The why is because I want to see positive change. I think both Dr. Hall and Dr. Tillman said it so well, is that in this diverse world, pluralistic world that we live in, we need to equip not just our future leaders, but our current leaders and those who have led to understand the importance of being inclusive. Recently, I had the opportunity to work with a large healthcare organization in the state of Indiana. And one of the things that they said is that they serve everyone who comes from their door. They have taken an oath to heal. And sometimes their staff or the doctors, nurses, technicians, they're not always aware of the cultural nuances of those individuals who are seeking help. Being able to provide training and to educate individuals on what does it mean to be inclusive? What are the competencies that we already have that we just need to rely on? How do we recognize differences, but besides recognizing them, how do we appreciate those differences? Inclusion and intersectionality can go hand in hand. If we look at ourselves and we identify ourselves using a diversity wheel, we're going to find out that each of us has something in common. So how do we build on the commonalities so that we can understand the differences? So in the nonprofit space, I really feel that those are individuals who are wanting to serve the greater community, but aren't always sure how to. Recently had an opportunity to work with the Boy Scouts of America. And in that space, those individuals were opened, their eyes were opened after they received their ICI feedback, the Inclusion Competency Inventory, and they realized that they have worked in a very close space that they have not really opened up because of socioeconomic status, because of race and ethnicity. And a lot of it went back to what does the leadership need to do differently? So each of those members developed their PDPs and they're working on how do I grow myself to become more inclusive? In other words, where's my level of self-awareness and recognition that I do have some unconscious biases, but that unconscious biases are normal, that we all have them. And this is something that we need to understand, recognize those triggers, and then we are able to move beyond that. Recognizing that at some point we may use a microaggression or micro inequity. And in that space, how do we recognize the person who's receiving that? Because what is micro to the person who is saying it can be macro to the person on the receiving end. How do we justify what we're doing and then realizing we shouldn't justify it, that we really need to work on building ourselves? So being able to train and work in this space, and one of the things that I love right now is working with an institution and changing their curriculum. How do we meet students where they're at so that when they go into the business world or into higher ed or into a graduate program, that they understand that they need to have cultural humility, that they need to have self-awareness, that they cannot function in today's world without this skill set. And that's why it's important for me to do the training, to integrate it into curriculum, to provide resources for others so that they will be able to change some of the things that are going on in today's society through truth and awareness and through social justice, allyship, and equity.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Wonderful. My own background is in adult education, and one of my mentors, the dear Janet Bennett, who taught me how to be a good trainer, always said, remember, Chris, it always starts with a who. Who's in the room? Get to know your learners. Let's talk about the who. Who are we training? Who are we teaching? Brian, let's start with you. Who are you training?
The primary area for us, for the tool at least, is in our academy, so Racial Justice and Healing Academy. And we're in the church context, so we often open things up to whomever will come. And that's challenging at points because you don't always know, who's there until they show up. It's a big connection of people. So there are 710 churches in our area. We're about 350,000 people that I represent in this context. And so if I hold this academy in one of our districts, it's a huge range of folks who are going to be coming into that. The ICI does help the individual, but everyone else is not privy to those results. Even I am not privy to those results. So I don't know always who's there. What I do know is from the group assessment that I can see what skills and resources those individuals need. And so the folks that I am reaching out to are the everyday individuals who live in various communities, going in and out of different cultures and experiences and heritages. And I'm trying to broadly to help impact change in those spaces and hopefully encourage folks to be more courageous in their efforts to engage with people of difference. One of the things we do with that is, Dr. Barnes mentioned implicit bias is one of the things that we use to help people better know themselves, which is one of the pieces of the ICI. Knowing where your implicit bias is very helpful. And I would not recommend this to everybody else, but I'm going to reveal one of my own biases. When I took the implicit bias test, I learned that I had a slight negative bias against Black males. And I am one. That's something that I need to know about myself. And I understand how that happened. I go to the same schools, learn from the same curriculums, watch the same movies, same TV shows, same news networks. And so all those negative stereotypes have been fed to me as well. And so that helped me to realize I've got some work to do about for myself to have a better self-image of myself and not reflect those things onto other people as well. So I want to offer that to other people to be able to do the same thing, to recognize their own weaknesses and strengthen those areas where they can. And that's for anybody that walks into one of our churches and is willing to go into this academy.
Thank you. And thank you for your sharing your vulnerability. That's important. With this work does take courage and some deep self-reflection. And it's not always easy to learn about ourselves, but it's also a gift. And if we frame it correctly, it can really do very fine work. Dr. Hall, who are you teaching? Who's coming to your classrooms? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so we have both efforts in play with graduate students right now, but we're working our way to undergraduate students. We've also began expanding our efforts to our faculty and staff so that they have the opportunity for discovery, and they're also prepared to role model these inclusive behaviors to our students. And not just faculty, but also the staff, the daily interactions with staff, students coming to the advising office, making sure that they have a positive experience with the people that are here to support them. This instrument can definitely help support that. Now, our college, as I mentioned, our college is very invested in ensuring that our students have those inclusive competencies and have that self-awareness to be able to work effectively across differences in group settings, in large organizational settings, and et cetera. So our college has instituted a multi-year strategic plan that we're dubbing the DEIB Core Curriculum Integration Plan, where we have committed to integrating issues of DEIB, cultural humility, and inclusive competencies into at least one of our core courses across all 7 disciplines in our undergraduate program. So our students will learn about inclusion and inclusive competencies in the management context, marketing, finance, and how they manifest themselves, hospitality, and so on. And so with this plan, the will be trained. They will be going through the ICI, because how can they effectively guide a conversation on inclusive competencies if they don't have the self-awareness themselves of their inclusive competencies and how they show up on a daily basis and who they are. Now, with our graduate program, we currently employ the ICI for all graduate students in our program. So here in Pamplin, our graduate programs, our home base is in Blacksburg, Virginia. However, we have most of our graduate programs in our Northern Virginia area. So we're also dealing with differences with proximity, but making sure that we have equity in our offerings across our campuses. And so we offer the ICI to all of our graduate students. There is also some pre-work that they do to kind of help center them, helping them understand what microaggressions are, micro inequities, how they show up as it relates to inclusive competencies with the inventory, and also areas for growth that they could be working on. Followed by that pre-work, including the ICI, they do participate in a 90-minute live training workshop so that they can, not just take the assessment, but they can understand the assessment. They can walk through with facilitators of the ICI. So the Kozai members of the Kozai group actually come to campus and walk with the students through their plan and start talking about the professional development plan. Now, although we've been offering this opportunity for graduate students over the last, I think, 2, maybe 3 academic years now, there is opportunity for us to enhance the effectiveness of the inventory with our students by providing post-training touch points. I think Dr. Tillman talked about professional development plans and meeting with them, talking through actual action steps that they can take to be effective. Well, right now, we are definitely limited in the post-training follow-up. So we're going to be working with the Kozai group in designing a plan for ICI follow-up, being that we have over 6,000 students. We have like hundreds of graduate students in different graduate programs. So trying to figure out a meaningful way that we can follow up with each and every graduate students to ensure that they are not just stopping at the assessment, but they are actually developing action steps that they can incorporate in their daily practices with the hopes of, transforming their behaviors.
Excellent, excellent work. And I wanted to highlight the fact that you have been talking to your faculty and staff about this work. I remember my very first peer-reviewed article was being an educator for social justice, and we interviewed everyone in our graduate school, including the support staff. And believe me, we got an earful and we got a hold of the support staff of what was or was not social justice and how it was or was not being enacted within our building. I was so glad I did that. I learned so much. It's fascinating. Dr. Barnes, who are you training? Talk about that.
Dr. Cartwright, before we get to that, there's a couple of burning questions.
Okay, let's go for it.
And I think the first one is going to go to Dr. Tillman. And the comment is, I know there's no way to talk about some troubling developments in our country when some politicians are pushing back on our D&I efforts, but can you please address this challenge? Thanks. And so Dr. Tillman, why don't you share a little bit on that one, please?
Yeah, so one, this is a sad and troubling development that we're seeing in a lot of states. I'm in Georgia, and we're seeing that trend here as well. I think more press goes to Florida, obviously, but Georgia has very similar practices that are not as well publicized. One of the things that I rely on is I'm in a religious context that's private. And is not bound by the things that happen in the like this in the local government context, but it does allow for me to advocate for those entities that do fall under the parameters that are being set now, with what kinds of topics can be discussed, what sort of books can be used, and so planning very carefully and strategic efforts that will help people who generally would not want to have that conversation to be able to have it in a way that they feel more comfortable being in. One of those is allowing people to isolate themselves. People are kind of in those echo chambers and they're just accustomed to hearing that same thread and then separate themselves out. And we feel uncomfortable invading in that space. We should absolutely invade those spaces. That allow people to hear a different perspective. And sometimes you have to temper your tone and how you communicate it, but continuing to keeping those lines of communication open. And even when you don't agree, that you find a way to continue to open up the lines of communication so that we can attack this in ways we can. Being in the church, I don't have the same parameters of school systems have. And so I can teach and lead, and some of those same individuals who are voting for these politicians that are passing these sort of laws are in our pews every Sunday. And that is an opportunity for pastors and leaders in my context to speak into that space. And so my role is to encourage them and equip them to be able to do that, to be willing to do that, and to do so wisely. You don't have to hit it with a sledgehammer. You can tinker with a little nail and a hammer here and there and crack the piece until it falls apart.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tillman. And what you said is amazing. And one of our guests today really said that these are not challenges that are exclusive to the USA. There are many copies, quote, of what is happening in the US around the world. And they went on to say, but I guess we must be prepared for society's reaction when privileged groups start feeling confined into their bubbles. So what you shared, I think, can be used in any context, and we don't need a sledgehammer, but we can chip away at it. And the next question goes to Dr. Hall. As you were talking about how you're implementing inclusion, cultural humility, and DEI on your campus, the question is, how are you handling this campus-wide expansion regarding staffing?
Yeah, so staffing is an issue across the board, right? Capacity to do the work, because it's so much, right? Let's give ourselves some grace. This is so much work, meaningful, impactful work that all of us are trying to do. And so how I'm handling staffing is Fortunately, being in the business school, and because our commitment is backed by our strategic plan and implementation plan, I'm getting the resources to be able to build capacity to be able to roll this out. For example, with our curriculum integration plan, we have recruited independent consultants, one being on this call, who is helping us with our efforts to integrate these issues. I would love to be a part of that hands-on, but I just can't. And I want this, because this work, it can be so sensitive, and in this landscape, even controversial. I want to make sure I'm bringing in the right people who understand assessments, who understand how this should be done in a way that is excellent and can be measured. Because we're in a space where outcomes matter, and so we want to see learning development within our student body. So we're bringing in the experts to help us tackle this. And what we're finding is that bringing in experts is helping us broadly with our assurance of learning plans that we have across our learning goals. So don't be afraid to bring in people. I mean, we have so much going on. We need to bring in people who have that mindset, who have the knowledge to really help us advance our efforts. And it's about partnerships and collaborations as well.
Thank you for that. The last question, I think this is the kind of fun one, is how are you embedding this work in your curriculum, in your training? What is it? What are the pieces of work that you are doing to make this come alive? We've talked about personal development plans and so forth, but I'm sure there are elements of your teaching and training that each of you are uniquely bringing that you could impart briefly to our audience so they get a flavor for how this work gets done. Dr. Barnes, let's start with you. Got a couple of gems to share.
Dr. Cartwright, I think one of the things that I'm very excited about is that in partnership with Dr. Hall and another colleague of mine, Dr. Greb, we have developed this model that builds on inclusion competencies and cultural humility, where we're looking at leader development. And so from leader development, we look at transforming behaviors, because the inclusion competency inventory allows us to transform. And when we are transforming, we start at the individual level, we go to the group level, and then we go to the organizational level. When we see those stages of transformation, and we're incorporating that in our training, also in our own personal lives, we are now becoming advocates that we can better listen to the voices of others, listening to those voices at a very deep level, not to respond, but to learn. And from those voices, we get to say, what do we need to change at the organizational level, the group level, and the individual level? Putting those changes into action keeps a complete transformative circle going on, that we're constantly developing in the areas of cultural humility, we're developing in the areas of inclusion competencies, and we are listening to those voices that may be underrepresented. And in that case, we create an organization that understands diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility. And they are driving transformative change at all levels of the organization. So it begins with the I, the individual, and that's one of the things I love with the inclusion competency inventory. We can't change everything around us unless we look inwardly and say, what do I need to change about myself? What do I need to know about others? How do I bridge differences? How do I recognize when power is used unjustly, and then that I speak up and say that it's being used unjustly, and not just sit back and watch it? And so the inclusion competency inventory gives us that platform, and it serves as a catalyst to drive these behaviors at the individual level that then percolate up throughout the entire organization.
Thank you. That's just a wonderful insight. I'm privileged to be writing a book chapter right now on inclusion with one of my colleagues, Dr. Alan Bird, and we've been playing with the construct that as an interculturalist, we understand how cultures are formed and are held, and the norms and the behaviors that help us belong, okay? But they also can form behaviors that exclude. So how do we, as the holders of the culture, recognize what we're doing And how do we open up that frame to be broader and more inclusive, to have a broader construct of inclusion and change the culture. And that's a benefit of this mindset and playing with it. Dr. Hall, some gems. What are some of the things that you're doing or see doing that are impactful?
Well, to start, I definitely echo Dr. Barnes' sentiments. I think to take it a step further, I think the environment, particularly if we're going to work toward educating our students, in the classroom itself needs to be psychologically safe to have these conversations. The classroom itself needs to be inclusive. It needs to feel as though, the behaviors of the faculty member, the behaviors of the other students have to feel as though they belong in that space. Belonging is subjective, and it's going to take us a while for us as an institution to assess belonging across our stakeholders. But one of the things that we do and have started doing is, again, employing and having workshops for our faculty, in particularly around inclusive pedagogy, making sure that even looking at their syllabus, making sure that their syllabi have inclusive language so that students can see themselves. Also, the case studies that they're using to talk about some of these issues, making sure that the protagonists that are in these studies are diverse. So those are some of the things that I can think of, just echoing Dr. Barnes, but that classroom space, the environment, it definitely matters.
Yeah, setting the learning container is so important, and people often ignore that. And it's once you learn to adopt this frame, it becomes an essential starting point. I'm glad you recognize it and are practicing it. Now, Brian, I know you love interactivity. I want to hear some of your stories. Talk to us about some of the fun things that you were building in. They're quite insightful.
So again, echoing the other two panelists, I think experiential opportunities are incredibly valuable. One of the areas of the ICI is valuing different perspectives. And I like to use tours for that, so getting people kind of out of their normal setting, and we're going to a couple of different places all at once over a day or two. And this allows them to sort of be at my mercy of sorts, putting in front of them some voices they generally would not hear. In some places they would generally not visit. And sometimes those places are not far at all, can be right around the corner from where they live. I remember last year we set up a tour around different places around North Georgia and around Atlanta. And we went to a town called Roswell, which is just north of Atlanta in the same county. And there are a couple of places called, quote, historic homes, which is often used to replace plantation instead. And so people drive by these historic homes all the time. They hold events there, weddings, and so on. And they had no clue the legacy of slavery that was in that place. And so I took some folks to a historic home, a former plantation that was right near where they live, work, play, go to church, etc. And they'd never been there before. And I asked them to listen to how the place is being described, what's being presented in this place. Is it presented as a place of pride or a place of terror? And why? And they did that, and they were astounded that the amount of energy and awareness and knowledge and history that was on display about the family that owned the property was enormous. And the amount of conversation, displays, awareness and knowledge of those who were forced to work on the property was nil. And what does that say about us? We go to some other contexts. Is it the same kind of thing for this sort of legacy of terror in a space? When I went to Germany, I didn't see a concentration camp elevated as a place of pride. it was appropriately placed as a place of terror. And we don't want to repeat this. We want you to know about this. It's a different space here. And so giving people an opportunity to be in those places where it's possible, to allow them to hear from first-person accounts. I remember taking folks to 16th Street Baptist Church, where they stood in front of the window where those 4 little girls were killed, and they heard from a woman who would have been the 5th little girl in that bathroom. It's a different perspective, and you're hearing it from people who were there. And she got to talk about the terror and the horror that she experienced and the trauma that she experienced and how it still lingers with her 50 years later. And then encourage people, a lot of these things took place because people were fighting for things like voting rights or for access to education. And some of those things are things that we now take for granted. If John Lewis can march 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery on foot with a fractured skull, then you can probably drive to your polling place and cast your ballot to vote. Those sort of narratives help people to hear different perspectives and understand the value that is there in hearing those perspectives and allowing those things to drive us forward into being better people, a better community, a better society, a better country, a better world.
Thank you. Thank you. Folks, I have one brief final question. I want you to be succinct, so we want to give people a chance to answer. What type of results are you seeing? Dr. Barnes, results, what are you seeing?
I think it depends. There are some groups that I consult and train with, and they're gung-ho, and then they realize that they feel like the hill is a mountain and they can't climb it, and the results are not positive. But then I have the majority of individuals who are transforming, not just themselves, but their organizations or their department within the organization. So I do believe that the ICI has become a catalyst for change, and it's become a catalyst for positive change.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Hall, what type of results are you seeing with your learners?
So we're starting to see, and again, we do have some limitations as it relates to how it's being employed right now. But again, we're just so excited to see how this is going to come full circle. But for the participants and the folks who have taken the ICI, and we've actually had some follow-up conversations with them, we're noticing that they're beginning to understand how their decision-making is and can be shaped and guided by their internal biases. And so they walk away with greater self-awareness. And then you have some students who might have talked about how their limited knowledge and understanding of power and power imbalances and how they manifest themselves in and across an organization, they really weren't sure what to do with that information, which is why we're going to be working on creating a meaningful follow-up touch point. So when these questions arise and our students go through the assessment, get their results, start implementing actions, if they have questions, they'll have people like those on this call who can help them navigate some of the challenges or uncertainties or unknowns that they may face as a result.
Excellent, excellent. Brian, what type of outcomes are you seeing with your people, your special program?
So one, I'm in this role. This is a relatively new role for us in my conference in the area. And it allowed for, we use the ICI with our upper level of, for lack, the bishop and the cabinet, which is like the superintendent, is the upper level of leadership for our United Methodist Conference. And it has allowed for us to have a more diverse pool of leaders of our boards and committees, including chair and co-chair roles. Now half of them have a person of color who are either chair or co-chair of those committees because they began to see that they were not being inclusive in their pool of people they were including as capable of chairing those committees. And so they challenged their own biases about that. And we've found and learned wonderful things about skill sets of people of different backgrounds, but very, very effective in their ability to lead. And so we see things like that all over our conference and looking forward to doing more.
Excellent, excellent. So folks, that's the end of the formal panel part of this. What I'd like to do is throw it open to the audience. You've been adding questions, which is great. I'm glad you have. But feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like, or raise your hand and we can call on you. But we'd like to hear your questions or insights. I know many of you and know of others of you here, and I know the collective brilliance that is online at the moment. So let's share. What are you seeing here? What are the possibilities or insights that are bubbling up for you? Anything?
Dr. Cartwright, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah, the
And,
social
I think
desirability
this,
impact. Yeah,
I
can.
love this because that's one of the things that we talk about often, but I'll let you take the start on that and then I
Sure.
can jump in because that's one.
Yeah, that was an important aspect of this particular psychometric development, and that we did build in a scale for social desirability. What's unique about the scales that the Kozai group builds is that it gives a range of social desirability. So a particularly low score may be someone who is underrepresenting or maybe humble about how they present themselves. A medium score is well balanced, able to be honest with themselves and others. And a higher score may have an overrepresentation, maybe even a bit of a bravado going on here. So that is built in. It's a measure that we take. It's embedded in the report, but unlike other inventories, it's embedded on the cover in a way that the administrator, the coach, can see it and use it to frame their questioning. It's not revealed directly to the end learner. We don't see it as a direct learning leverage point, as other inventories might do. And we found that that is of great value to the researcher and the administrator, teacher, trainer, but framed differently for the learner. So it's there and very impactful.
Yeah, so thanks, Chris. You covered most of that. I think the one thing is that I don't share that with the user of the assessment. However, I use it to help them form their personal development plan and helping them to grow. Because sometimes individuals think social desirability scores are a gotcha, and that's not what they are intended for. We have a couple other questions. So the next one is, and I think we've kind of done this, Chris, with the Kozai group, but what are the challenges to expand the ICI, and will it be validated outside the US?
Well, we actually started, our original pool was 500 people from around the world. They were very diverse, purposely. It is considered a global instrument. So it's still a baby tool. We would like to build a larger pool. We're working on that with the help of the fine people online today and others who have begun to administer it. And it is publicly available, but it will be used around the world, and we're working on that. So that's part of our work. Definitely.
Yolanda, thank you. I think we can find a way to get that in Brazil, definitely. So the next one is, this is for you, Chris, how are the results used to communicate strategically within the organization? This individual has used the IDI for similar effects within the university, and appreciate being able to say X% is the minimization and Y's is the polarization. How does the ICI allow that as well?
Within our methodology, besides the individual report, we can generate a group report, which will give you a schema of the 6 dimensions and 3 factor areas and the overall. So you get 10 points of data on your group, which will give you patterns of where are going. So you could make decisions about where to focus energy or where you have strengths that you can leverage. And you can also use it in a pre-post format, so you can see the impact of the intervention that you have been working on. So that's a good way to do that. But because there are literally 10 points of data, there is an overall one, and you can certainly use that as this is where you started and this is where you're going. But I actually love the edges of the different dimensions and looking at, oh, isn't that interesting? We seem to have some challenges with power, or I wasn't expecting reading others to be a problem with the group of linguists, but guess what it is? So maybe we want to talk about reading others and seeing what we can do in that space. So those are ways the data. And you can also, if you're a researcher, request your dimension level raw data and run research reports on how that work is going. So
time we have a couple of other questions. We'll be more than happy to respond to those questions via email. I think we're saving the chat. So
we'll be getting back to you. By all means, we want to thank you all for your time and energy. I want to specifically thank Dr. Barnes, Dr. Hall, Dr. Tillman for their time and energy and good spirits and sharing with us, and that you will get a link to this recording to follow up with us afterward. And by all means, feel free to reach out to the Kozai group and ask us any questions. It's been a joy having you here with us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is good work, fine work, and we're pleased to be a part of it along with you, in partnership with you. Have a good day.